Police say they don't even have his real name. He boarded the aircraft as Dan Cooper, not D.B. Cooper. The man, the myth, the legend that is D.B. Cooper. That's your episode today on Destination Aviation. Well, welcome back to the show, friends and colleagues and people who just listened. I'm your host, Jeff Miller. Thanks for coming back. Thanks for having patience with me. I know I've heard from quite a few people, actually, which always makes the heart happy that people are listening about getting an episode out. And I'm going to apologize. It's just the day job has been keeping me busy and busier as of late. Always good stuff, though. It's just, it's always difficult to put this into place. Same with the biplane. Haven't changed the biplane plans. Let's say that 3 times in a row. Have not changed them. Just adjusting as things happen that are outside my control, like the factory going out of business. I did have one of the mechanics reach out to me that was at that factory and was there actually when I toured it. And again, sad situation to see all 60 of them without a job. Hopefully they're finding their ways, as this industry needs good, talented people. I wish they were still making the beautiful Wacos, but outside of our control. So all those plans are in place and moving forward. It's just, again, sitting down, finding a couple hours, especially an episode like this where it's a narrative. Interviews, depending on the interview, sometimes they go really well. If there's a lot of edits, that can take a immense amount of time. So it's just hard to really say, kind of sit down and put pen to paper or speech to microphone, something like that. But I actually get to enjoy these episodes. I enjoy all of them, but these ones for me especially, I get a little more time to rant and rave, which if you were at our general aviation conference, you get to hear plenty of me doing that. Chicago Executive Airport. Boy, look at, I am at a speed here, huh? I'm flipping all over the place. It is always difficult to get back into the swing of things on things, but I'm going to try to stop saying things for you here for a little bit as you sit down and we talk a little bit about a story. What I was going to say is we turned 100, so we hosted the American Association of Airport Executives General Aviation Conference. So I got to see a lot of my friends back into the city, meet new friends, new people. Got to speak with Maury Gallagher a little bit, who created Allegiant Airlines. So he was the keynote that we brought in, and he wrote a book called Airline Odyssey? I think that's right. I might be getting it wrong. He did sign a copy of it for me, and so did Jennifer as well, who was on the podcast. Go back and listen to that episode if you want. It was a great episode. But no, it was good. It was nice. We have a beautiful week of weather here in Chicago. I know many people that have traveled away from Chicago, which, again, this time of year, I don't know why you would. It's beautiful here. All they keep telling me on the weather is enjoy the next week. So I haven't even looked at what comes after that. But if they're saying enjoy the next week, let's just take it that they're looking out for the next 7 days, and beyond that, maybe it will be just as good. Who knows? So a couple of things with this story. Now, you heard at the beginning, Mr. D.B. Cooper. This is a story that, quite honestly, for me in aviation, I thought has been done and overdone and is well done and is stuck in the oven and is on fire and it's burning the house down. But as I've come to learn, so I think I put a picture out on our TikTok, which if you haven't gone over and checked that out, please go ahead and do so. If you want to, you don't have to, but if you want to, go take a look at it. We put a picture out a while back. My brother was so kind to give me a Mini Cooper back in the day, and I have named that DB Cooper. And so I got personalized plates on the car, and nobody knew who he was. Okay, so there's that. People kept asking me, are you a nurse? Because I see CPR, right? Because you got to make it look cheeky, because you can't just get DB Cooper. Okay, so nobody knew. So fast forward a year of owning this car. I am at the place where they inspect your car. And here in Illinois, people that were just released from prison, they put people back into these facilities to inspect your vehicles. At least that's so I've been told. That's what happens. But I pull up the car, I put it in park. This guy comes around, big long beard. It's been a year, right? He goes, "Is it you?" And I'm sitting there, and I'm like, "What?" He goes, "Is it you?" And I was like, "I don't know what you're talking about." But laughing too, because I don't know what he wants. And then he points to the license plate, and I'm like, "Oh my God, you're the first person to know who DB Cooper was." Of course, a convict knew who DB Cooper was. So it was fun. I enjoyed the laugh. Enjoyed the inspection I got too, because the car passed. So that's always a good thing. So, anyways, okay, I got my Mini Cooper. Haha, I'm an aviation DB Cooper. Delta Airlines. I was down at their museum. They're giving my Mini Cooper a run for its money. They have one that's decked out like an aircraft. Okay, so we all know. Okay, no, nobody knows. Okay, so I start talking to people, and I'm like, yeah, you know the story, ransom, put money on the aircraft, jumped out, nothing, crickets for the majority. So I'm going to do two things here. I'm tired of completely explaining it. As a matter of fact, I've had people come up to me and say, "You've done a really good podcast on DB Cooper. You should go listen to Jeff's podcast on it." And then I have to say I never did it because I didn't want to do it, because it's a good story. It's a great story. But if you're in our industry, you've heard it like 50 million times. So I thought. But apparently not. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go through my version of it. Hopefully you like it, and if you don't, there's plenty of other resources out there. If it gets you at least tantalized to go out into Oregon and start searching for money, they made a whole movie without a paddle about it. It's one of Seth Green's favorite movies, as far as I know, at least from all the fun he makes on it and his other programs. But without a paddle is around that idea. But this story is oldest time, and by that I mean the 1970s. So not that old, not that far off from any of us are or were, as a matter of fact, from the 1970s. And so I'm going to do that. I'm going to talk about it. And then at the end, I'm going to have a little Easter egg, a little unknown story that I didn't know about, that somebody, family member, turned me on to more recently. Maybe the same family member who gave me the vehicle. And so I'm going to leave that towards the end. It's a shorter story. But if you're sitting there right now, rolling your eyes and dragging your hands down your face as you sit on your international flight coming home and go, "I've heard this story 8 million times, Jeff. I don't need to hear it again." Well, at least you'll hear it with some of my humor. So that's a win. And then secondly, there'll be a nice little story at the end for all of us to maybe enjoy as a little Easter egg, a little before Easter snack. We got a long ways to go to Easter. Maybe before a little Labor Day snack. But all right, I hope your seatbelts are on, you're locked into your seat, the tray table's up, because we're going to jump right into this story of Mr. Dan Cooper. On November 24th, 1971, the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, a man calling himself Dan Cooper walked into the Portland International Airport and bought a one-way ticket to Seattle. And before we go any further, let's get one thing straight. His name wasn't DB Cooper. At least that's not the name he gave the airline. The ticket was purchased under the name Dan Cooper. Somewhere along the way, because of the media screw-up, Dan Cooper became DB Cooper. And apparently, nobody has bothered to correct it for more than 50 years. So technically, this episode should probably be called the Dan Cooper Mystery. But let's be honest, DB Cooper does sound better. So we're going to go with DB Cooper, because it's probably what he meant anyways. So Dan Cooper, like the guy who's coming to fix your refrigerator between noon and 4. Yeah, that guy, Dan Cooper. Could be anybody. So we're going to go with DB. So we're setting the scene, right? So it's November 24th, 1971. That's the day before Thanksgiving. People want to get to their loved ones. Big travel day, right? A lot of people are getting ready for that long travel home. We all either are the family member that nobody wants to see, or there's a family member that we maybe just aren't as ecstatic to see. Don't know where you fall in life. Or maybe you're a solid family and you just can't wait till Thanksgiving, because maybe that's the way it is. But, Thanksgiving always throws around some good opportunities for us to get together with our families, whether you like it or not. Cooper wasn't doing anything that at first wouldn't have made him stand out. He wasn't carrying a giant, mysterious box. He wasn't running through the terminal. He wasn't yelling about how he was going to hijack an airplane, which in retrospect would have made the whole thing much easier. He walked up to the Northwest Orient ticket counter at the Portland International Airport. He paid cash. He bought a one-way ticket, Portland to Seattle. The price? Now this is going to shock everybody. This is probably the biggest shocker of the whole thing. $18.86. Why did he even feel like he had to rip the airline off any further? He obviously got away with the steal of the century right there. Today, $18.86 might get you a sandwich and a bottle of water at an airport, depending on the airport you're at. We have street pricing here. If the street charges you 5 times as much. But yes, okay, we laughed and we jest. In 1971, it got you onto a commercial airliner, just for a $20 bill. The FBI does preserve Cooper's ticket under the name of Dan Cooper and identifies the Portland to Seattle trip for Flight 305 with the $18.86 fare. And this is when you put your back into 1971, right? Flying was different. Airport security was different. Very different. There was no TSA. Still fairly new organization. Not as new as I remember, but let's not date anybody. There were no modern security checkpoints like we know today. I was going to say you don't have to take your shoes off, but I think that's gone to the wayside too with new technology. So what is old is new again. No more stinky feet at the checkpoint. The liquids, the plastic bags are still in association today. You could just go to the airport and get on an airplane, basically, right? Like you're going to a bus station and headed on out. Which, again, with the advances in technology, maybe we'll be back to there someday again. I don't know. Only this time you'll be getting your face scanned, which we all know how people feel about flock cameras. So maybe that will get the flock out of here, too. We talked about getting just on the aircraft. It's insane that, at that point, right, it sounds like, do you need not to have identification to prove who you are, etc., etc. But you're operating in a world where a lot of times things like driver's license didn't even have a picture on them. That's the world that Dan Cooper was operating in. His flight was Northwest Flight 305, a short hop from Portland to Seattle on a Boeing 727-100. Probably today a type of flight. Well, this is 2 big cities, so you might see an Airbus or 737 creep in there, but I feel like these days you might be rolling in a CRJ 200 or maybe a 175. I do like a 175. The registration on this 727 was November 467 Uniform Sierra. Now, this podcast is Destination Aviation, so we have to talk about the airplane. It's important, it's critical to the story. I don't just think the 727 set the story. In many ways, it's kind of the main character. The 727, as people who listen to this, 3-engine jet, with its engines mounted at the rear of the fuselage and a distinctive T-tail. Now, the people that listen to this that are in aviation are going to say, no crap, Jeff. But those who don't, bear with me through that section. Because that's what it looked like. Or if you were an airplane fan, right? It looks like a giant Tylenol. This particular airplane had something that would become incredibly important to what happened next. It had a set of stairs. And not just any stairs. A rear air stair that dropped down on its own. Didn't even need someone to push it up like Jeff Miller. And if you know anything about the D.B. Cooper story, you know exactly where I'm going with that comment. But before a man disappeared out the back of a 727 into the darkness over the Pacific Northwest, before $200,000 was delivered, before the FBI launched one of the largest investigations in its history, Dan Cooper had to get on the airplane and look like just another passenger. A man in a business suit, white shirt, dark tie, carrying a briefcase. Nothing about him screamed, "Hey, watch this." And that's when Flight 305 took off. And then somewhere between Portland and Seattle, Dan Cooper, or D.B. Cooper, handed the flight attendant a note. At that point, everything changed. Flight 305 took off from Portland, and at this point, nobody else on board knew what Dan Cooper was about to do. The FBI's account describes Cooper as a quiet man, appearing to be in his mid 40s, dressed in a business suit with a white shirt and black tie. While the airplane was still waiting to depart, he ordered a bourbon and soda. So far, nothing out of the unusual, except for getting a bourbon and soda before the plane's off. He must have been in first class. Just another guy in a suit, sitting on an airplane having a drink. And honestly, considering what he was about to do, apparently, I feel like I would needed to say something stronger than a bourbon and soda. I don't know what's stronger than that, but we can use our imagination this day and age. If you look at the back of the Mini Cooper, I actually have a sketch I bought online. Shout out to Andrew for helping me find such pictures, sweet pictures to put on my Mini Cooper. But it is of the FBI's sketch of what Mr. D.B. Cooper would look like from what I just described to you. A short time after 3 o'clock that afternoon, Cooper handed the flight attendant Florence Schaffner a note that makes the story almost surreal. According to the account of what happened, Florence initially did not immediately read the note. Cooper then made sure she understood that she needed to pay attention. He told her, "Miss, you better look at that note. I have a bomb." Now, the FBI's accounts of exactly what happened there aren't completely well preserved, but the general gist is that's how it went down. So imagine in that moment, you're a flight attendant on what should have been a routine flight, a passenger hands you a note, and suddenly you're being told there's a bomb on the airplane. Florence did what he asked. She sat beside him, and Cooper opened his briefcase. Inside, she saw what appeared to be a mass of wires and red-colored sticks. Was it actually a bomb? Well, we don't know. And that's important. What we do know is that Cooper successfully convinced the people around him that it was a bomb. And under the circumstances, they had absolutely no reason to test whether he was bluffing. And remember the scene as well. We've talked a little bit in the past about 9/11 as we're reaching the 20th anniversary of that unfortunate event. But 1970s is time period, right? It wasn't completely unheard of hijackings of aircraft and people taking aircraft. So this seemed to be, okay, this is what he's demanding. Let's move along. Like I said, 9/11 kind of changed that whole thought process and how the airlines looked at these type of activities. But back then, at least historically, what was understood is they were hijacking the aircraft for some intended purpose. So, at that time, the demands began. Cooper told Florence to write down what he wanted. He wanted $200,000 and 4 parachutes. And he wanted that money in $20 bills. Florence took those demands forward to the captain. In the FBI's historical accounts, Cooper demanded $200,000 in 20 bills, 4 parachutes, so that all kind of jives. Again, we're trying to piece together a bunch of stuff in history here. And this is where you start to think that the realization of whether this guy was an aviation expert or not had to clearly put some thought behind what he was doing, whether which way it goes. Again, debates go on for now decades. Because 4 parachutes is a very interesting number. Why 4? Well, there are some very interesting theories out there on the number 4. One of the most common is that by asking for multiple parachutes, Cooper may have wanted authorities to think he could force someone to leave the airplane with him. Not a bad thought, right? If you're in these type of activities and maybe you think the authorities would tamper with your parachute, 4 obviously gives you more options to mess with, but also 2, you could be taking out an innocent person. So that one probably has some legs to it. That's believable. But at the end of the day, he never explained why he wanted 4. So we just have to assume. But if you're being, common sense approach to it, it's quite possible that that theory would pan out. So meanwhile, think about what else is happening on the aircraft. The passengers don't know the full story. The crew now has to deal with an armed, or at least apparently armed, hijacker. And up front, the pilots have an airplane to fly. This is something that gets lost when we look at back in one of the most famous aviation events. The story doesn't stop being an aviation event because it becomes a crime. You still have altitude, fuel, navigation, communication, weather, an entire aircraft full of people. The crew now has to safely manage all of that while trying to get the guy with an apparent bomb exactly what he wants. No pressure at all, right? No pressure. One of the first problems Cooper had was time. Cooper wanted money and the parachutes. They weren't just sitting on the ramp in Seattle waiting for him. The authorities at Northwest now had to figure out how to get everything together while Flight 305 remained in the air. So instead of making a normal short trip from Portland to Seattle, the flight was now about to become a whole lot longer. A Northwest flight remains airborne here in Seattle as authorities work to meet the hijackers' demands. And while the people on the ground scrambled to find $200,000 in 4 parachutes, Flight 305 began to circle. Now the situation has changed. Flight 305 is still in the air. The crew knows they have been hijacked. The passengers know something is happening. And on the ground in Seattle, authorities have a very unusual shopping list. $200,000, 4 parachutes, and 4 fried chickens. Just kidding. Blues Brothers reference. After all, we're here in Chicago. No. The chickens weren't on the list. They can't even fly. So authorities apparently need to get all of this ready pretty damn quick. The ransom was not just get him 200 grand. Cooper wanted the money in $20 bills. There's a reason for that, and it's important. The FBI had serial numbers recorded. That meant that every single bill could be completely identified later on. So a couple of things with that. We've all seen Breaking Bad, right? We know how hard it is if you just get a wad of cash, how to spend it. That's not how life works. So this is before the days of cryptocurrency. We just had an intern who told me all about how cryptocurrency is just another way of doing business. Nothing to see here. And I'm like, I get that, but cryptic, it's in the name. I'm pretty sure people do a lot of nefarious things, right? You gotta wash money. So in this case, if he's asking for $20 bills, and they're talking 1970s, their FBI is literally writing down serial numbers as they're putting this money together. And so the more money that he has, the lower denomination, easier to spend, harder to trace. They kind of get the idea. But again, somebody very smart to come up with that. I can't say that I would have come up with that on the spot. I don't think so. Maybe, but I don't think so. So in retrospect, it seems like a pretty important detail if you're planning on becoming the world's most famous, unidentified hijacker. It's kind of like robbing a bank and asking the teller to put your name on the money. So obviously, what we just talked about, Cooper had a plan for that. Then there was another part of the shopping list, which we talked about, but the parachutes, 4 of them. And this is where things get interesting from an aviation standpoint, because Cooper wasn't simply asking for a parachute, he wanted options. He wanted 2 primary parachutes and 2 reserve parachutes. The Cooper's demand of 4 parachutes of 2 primary and 2 reserve is from the FBI account, but it goes back to maybe a deeper understanding of aviation, because quite honestly, I've never skydived. I couldn't tell. I've heard a reserve. I think it means what it sounds like, right? It means like you have a reserve chute from your primary. And we've all seen the stories. Recently, we just saw the person who, was parachuting and unfortunately had an aircraft hit their parachute, but they survived. So think about what this tells you, right? This wasn't just an impulse. He had already thought about getting out of the airplane. He had thought about the equipment that he needed, and he had thought enough about the parachutes to know he didn't just want one. But here's where we have to separate what we know from what we think. We don't actually know why Cooper requested 4 parachutes. Those are the theories we've talked about, at least one of them. But we don't have a note from Cooper explaining his reasoning behind this. So what's happening back on the airplane? While all of this is happening on the ground, Flight 305 is still airborne. And the flight crew has a very difficult problem. They can't just land and hand Cooper the money, because the money isn't ready. The parachutes aren't ready. The whole point of Cooper's demands is that he wants to leave the airplane with them. So they wait, and they circle, and they communicate. We've all been on enough of those flights. I just had a bunch of people come to Chicago to visit me, and all I heard was how delayed they were. Now, we did have the fantastic air and water show going on, so hopefully everybody got a nice view of that from their window seat as they circled O'Hare Midway, whatever airport they were landing at. But in this case, our aircraft is circling over the Pacific Northwest. And somewhere in the middle of all this, you have the strangest possible combination of people. A hijacker sitting calmly in the back of a 727, flight attendants trying to keep everyone calm, pilots flying the airplane, air traffic controllers dealing with the flight, and law enforcement on the ground trying to figure out how the hell they're going to satisfy the demands. And nobody knows how it's going to end. And then there's everybody else, the passengers. The people that boarded an airplane expecting a short flight from Portland to Seattle, perhaps, to go back home to Thanksgiving. Instead, they're now sitting on a hijacked airliner. And here's the thing. We know the story because we've had 50 years of hindsight. They didn't. And I talk about that 50 years because I have everybody that tells me, D.B. Cooper, who's that? Except for the one man who came out to my Mini Cooper and said, "Are you him?" But beyond that, everybody else. Now, I will say, one of them is our newest employee, and he also tells me that Hootie and the Blowfish is country music, which, no, it's not. We all know that Darius Rucker is Hootie, and we also know that Darius Rucker has his own solo career. It's easy to know, if you weren't alive in the 90s like this gentleman wasn't. If Darius Rucker puts on a baseball cap, he is pretending to be Hootie. And you're going to hear some sweet 90s pop rock. If Hootie decides to put on his country hat, he has now morphed into Darius Rucker and is going to play some country music. I divert from our conversation briefly just to say, okay, come on. But also, too, a lot of people don't know the story. So I didn't just take it with one thought. But if it wasn't one person who told me the thing about Hootie the Blowfish, you wouldn't even be hearing me talking right now. All right. We got to get back on this 727 because DB's not going to wait for us. Or should I say Dan or whoever he's going by at this point. So the people didn't know that Cooper was serious, not serious. Was this a bomb? Was the bomb not real? They didn't know if they were going to live, if they were going to survive. And they certainly didn't know they were sitting inside what would become one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in American history. Obviously, I think what we'll dive into a little bit further here, because you're on an aviation podcast, so what make it a little bit different than maybe other the 5,000 documentaries on this, or not. But of course, everybody I talk to doesn't know the story, so new information, maybe. So, I'm going to slow it down, because Flight 305 wasn't just flying around aimlessly. The airplane had crew, it had fuel, it had weight. It had operational limitations, and the crew had to keep the aircraft flying safely airborne while all this was happening. That's something I think is fascinating about the Cooper case. Even during the hijacking, the laws of aviation don't stop. The airplane still has to fly, the engines still have to run. Fuel gets burned slowly, but still getting burned, or fastly. This is the 70s, and I did just see a ratio of a new aircraft taking off, and it was insane how much fuel consumption there was. And eventually, the pilots had to land. So at this point, Cooper tells the crew that he wants them to continue on to Seattle. Obviously, that's where everybody's waiting for him, Northwest on the ground, or at least will be waiting with the $200,000 in 20s and 4 parachutes. So he starts telling the crew what he wants them to do after that. And his requests become one of the more interesting parts of this entire case, especially if you're one of my audience members, so you're listening to the aviation side of this. Yes, we're all locked up on this. Because he doesn't simply just say, fly me somewhere. He starts specifically telling them how he wants the 727 operated. Altitude, speed, configuration, and eventually the destination. And those requests tell us something. Well, maybe. They might tell us that Cooper knew airplanes. They might tell us he understood the intricacies of a 727. Or just a general understanding of flight, I should say. I mean, up to this point. But speed and stuff, if you're telling speed, I'm going to go back. I'm going to say he probably did understand the 727 a bit. You just don't know what the configuration on an approach speed or in a 172 versus a Waco is. It's not something that falls out of the sky unless you have a pilot operating handbook. They might tell us he had experience with parachuting. Or it also could simply tell us that he did his homework. And that distinction matters. As Flight 305 continued to circle Seattle, the money was being assembled, the parachutes were being gathered, and Cooper was waiting. But he wasn't waiting forever. Eventually, the plane would land, the passengers would get off, and the man sitting in the back of the 727 would still be there, because he wasn't finished. He is just getting started. Eventually, Flight 305 arrived to Seattle, its intended destination. And now came the moment everybody had been working towards, the exchange. Cooper had asked for $200,000 in $20 bills. He had asked for 4 parachutes, and in the exchange, he was willing to let people on the aircraft go. The money and the parachutes were delivered, and Cooper released all 36 passengers. Okay, I just gotta say, I didn't realize on this aircraft till I was doing research on it that there was only 36 people on a 727. I guess that's kind of a hello deregulation coming in 1978. Probably back to maybe our CRJ 200 comment. Of course, again, between Portland and Seattle these days, they probably have more than 36 passengers on a flight. And this is even before Thanksgiving, so think about it. Think about today. Think about if you got on the day before Thanksgiving on any flight, you would be totally screwed. There's no way there would be 36 people. Okay, that and the price of the ticket. It got me. All right, let's keep on moving. He released 2 members of the crew. So as far as my research is done, that's on top of the 36, not including the 36. For all of you keyboard warriors out there that will send me a message and tell me I got it wrong, have at it. But that's from the research that I have. You know, it's all fun and games talking about it 50 years later into a microphone on a platform that never even existed back then. But you have to think about what it must have felt like to be on that aircraft, to be one of the passengers or crew members. But like in the passenger side, right? You board an airplane in Portland for what you would think could be a quick flight to Seattle. Somewhere along the way, you find out the guy sitting on the airplane with you has a bomb. The flight stays airborne while authorities scramble to meet his demands, and eventually you land. The doors open, and you're allowed to leave. I don't know how you go back to normal after that. You were supposed to be traveling the day before Thanksgiving. I guess you had a great conversation piece if you did find yourself in one of those scenarios where, you know, you are the family member that nobody wants to talk to. Be like, Jeff finally has an interesting story. His plane was hijacked. So you just became a witness to one of the most famous crimes in American history. You still don't know that that's how it's all unfolding, right? You probably think this guy's getting caught down in Oregon somewhere. Who knows? So you made your Thanksgiving dinner a little bit awkward, probably, with your story. How was your flight? Well, yeah, a small minor detail. I wonder if anybody stood up and said, that guy's name was Dan, not DB. This is bullshit. Who knows? Oh, no, now I gotta put the explicit mark on this episode. And it's alright. I'm a bit of a swearer, but not much. As you can tell, not much. So as the passengers begin to disembark from their 727, having to kind of realize what's actually happening right now, they did make it to their intended airport, so yeah, give them that. Dan Cooper wasn't going anywhere. At least not yet. Because this was never his final destination. So we have an empty 727. Cooper kept several crew members on board, including the pilot, and now the story was about to change completely. Up to this point, this was a hijacking. A terrifying one, obviously, but there was still a fairly straightforward objective. From the perspective, everyone's trying to resolve it. Get him the money, get him the parachutes, and get the passengers off safely. Mission accomplished, one might say, right? Except Cooper wasn't done. Cooper ordered the crew to take the 727 off again. He wanted it to head towards Mexico City. Now that sentence sounds simple. Take me to Mexico City. I said it many times when I was in Laredo. Okay? Except this is where the aviation side of this story becomes absolutely fascinating, because Cooper wasn't just going to get on the Boeing 727, point south, and disappear into Mexico. He was about to start telling the crew how he wanted the airplane flown. And that's important, because some of these instructions would later become part of the debate about who this guy was and how much he actually knew about airplanes. So things are getting a little more interesting now, right? Think about where we are. The passengers are gone. The FBI and law enforcement know exactly what they're dealing with. The ransom is now on board. There are parachutes on board. And sitting somewhere towards the back of the 727 is a man who's just successfully hijacked an airplane, gotten exactly what he demanded, and is now preparing for the next phase, the escape. And this is where I think the D.B. Cooper story stops being just a fascinating crime story, and it becomes aviation folklore. Because the next several hours would involve one of the most unusual flights in American aviation history. A Boeing 727, a small crew, a hijacker, $200,000 in cash, and 4 parachutes. Again, sounds a little bit like the Blues Brothers if you've seen the movie, but if you don't know about this story, then you probably don't know that joke either, so that's okay. Just remember, Hootie and the Blowfish is a country band. And a flight plan was about to become very, very unusual. So before that 727 takes off from Seattle, let's talk about what Cooper wanted. Because he had some very specific ideas about how the airplane was going to fly. And some of those demands may be the biggest clue as to about who we know Dan Cooper really was. So right before takeoff, we're in Seattle, the passengers are gone, Cooper has $200,000 and he has his parachutes. Then he tells them to take off and fly to Mexico. But here's where it gets interesting. He doesn't just say, take me to Mexico City. He starts telling them how to fly the airplane. Cooper wanted the airplane at 10,000 feet or below. This is a very specific request, and we're going to see a pattern here. He wanted this airplane flown in a way that would make the next part of his plan possible. He also wanted the landing gear down, and he wanted the flaps down. More specifically, FBI records say that during the discussion, 15 degrees of flap were identified. Again, very specific. You're not an aviation person. All that may sound like meaningless technical jargon, but it absolutely isn't. Landing gear down creates a lot of drag. 15 degrees of flap adds more drag, and drag slows the airplane down. And slowing the airplane down appears to have been very important for Mr. Cooper. It's one of the moments where you can understand why people have spent 50 years asking, who the hell was this guy? Because this isn't just somebody saying, fly low. He's discussing the configuration of a Boeing 727. Now, does that prove he was a pilot? No. Does it prove he was a military parachutist? No. Does it prove he ever worked on a 727? Also, no. What it proves is that he had access to, or at least learned some very specific information. And remember, this was before ChatGPT and Grok or any of the other companies that say, we're AI now. So DB got the flaps he wanted, 15 degrees. He got the altitude he wanted, and now he's about to get the airspeed he wanted. Indicated airspeed of about 170 knots. An important aviation distinction. That's 170 knots indicated airspeed, not necessarily 170 knots over the ground. The FBI's account estimated that this produced a ground speed of about 205 miles per hour under the conditions that night. So if you've ever heard somebody say casually, Cooper jumped out at 170 miles an hour, that's oversimplifying aviation. For this story, the better way to say it is that a 727 was flown at about 170 knots indicated airspeed. And then there were the stairs. The real air stairs, not fake ones that Jeff Miller rolls up on you when you pull up. This is part of the Boeing 727, and it made it the entire escape possible. The 727 had built-in air stairs at the rear of the aircraft. Cooper wanted that rear door open and the stairs extended. My time in dealing with one of these backdoor stairwells was in the Mad Dogs, the MD-80s, when Allegiant used to fly them. Just spoke about Maury Gallagher. We had him at the conference, the creator of Allegiant Airlines. But they had the drop down stairs in the back. So when Allegiant Airlines would come into like Stockton, California, they would want to load in the front and the back, kind of fill the aircraft up twice as fast as it kind of worked. You had to leave it up to the passenger to decide, okay, is seat 20 closer to the front door or the back door? But in my real world experience, I've seen some 727s. I saw San Jose Sharks would fly on the Fry's aircraft. They had a 727. And so I've seen them around, but the air stairs really like in full blown working, I'd say at Allegiant Airlines with their Mad Dogs. But in this case, Cooper knew he needed the air stairs in the back of the aircraft to make that escape possible. So Cooper wanted the doors extended. In fact, according to FBI records, he initially wanted them to take off that way, but there was just one problem. The crew told him they couldn't take off with the stairs extended. So Cooper eventually agreed that the aircraft could depart with the stairs up and they could be lowered after the airplane was airborne. I'd be happy to hear from any 727 enthusiasts if that was actually true or not. I couldn't find, through my research, if it indeed could be extended during takeoff. I mean, obviously, it feels like there would be issues with that just thinking about it, but I don't know if there was some sort of a safety feature that would stop it. So, because if you're looking at this as a single biggest reason people think Cooper knew something about the airplane, this is probably it. Because in this kind of configuration with air stairs in the back, he knew about the real air stairs. I mean, I didn't know about real air stairs even when I started working in airports until I got to Stockton and I saw the Mad Dog. Now you see him pop out every once in a while. I think I've seen some videos online, maybe 737, but in the front where they pop down. Not necessarily like this where they pop out of the back. But you would have to think you'd have some knowledge to know, especially back then, again, before really computers and everything, that this aircraft did have air stairs in the back. So he either knew or he had learned that this could be used in flight. That doesn't tell us where he learned it, but it does tell us that it wasn't completely a random idea to take that 727 from Portland. Cooper had other instructions too. He wanted the cabin lights out. He wanted everyone to remain forward of the first class curtain. In other words, he wanted the rear of the airplane completely to himself, which makes perfect sense if you're planning to do something in the back of the airplane that you don't want anybody watching. And yes, that sounds obvious now, but at some time, nobody knew exactly what the story was going to be and how it would end. But there was another problem, and this was Mexico City. The crew explained that under the conditions Cooper was demanding, they could not make it there nonstop. Remember what we're doing here: gear down, flaps extended, low altitude, slow speed. All of this creates drag, and all of that drag means fuel, a lot of it. So there was a negotiation. If they couldn't get to Mexico City, where would they go? The FBI file records has several locations being discussed. Now, as pilots out there, right, you're like, oh, these are my diversion airports. Phoenix, Yuma, Sacramento, okay, and eventually Reno, the world's biggest little city, is that what they call it? Used to get my hair cut there when I had hair. Reno, Nevada, it was. Used to be home of the Reno air races, but to be no more. I did see them while they were still there. But so they're going to land in Reno. Okay, so that's where we're going to go and refuel. And I absolutely love this part of the story because it shows just how much aviation is driving anything in this story and everything in this story. And what happens next is just on top of aviation folklore. Cooper may have had a plan, but the 727 had to obey physics. We all have to do it. You can demand Mexico City all day long, but if you got the landing gear hanging out, the flaps deployed, you're flying low and slow, and the airplane gets a vote. So I think we all kind of knew he probably wasn't going to make it all the way to Mexico City. He just wanted his configuration to bail out, especially if he was asking for the stairs to be down on departure. But who knows? So now we're left with the question, how did Cooper know of all this? Did he have aviation experience? Was he a pilot? Did he work around airplanes? Was he a parachutist? Or had he simply done enough homework to know exactly what he needed? And that's one of the things that makes this case so fascinating. Because every time you think you found a clue that tells you where he was, or who he was, or how he did this, it opens up 3 more possibilities. So now we know. Cooper got everything that he wanted configuration-wise, and the destination was Reno. The ultimate plan was still Mexico, and somewhere in the back of that 727, Mr. Dan Cooper was preparing to disappear. The airplane was out of Seattle, and for the next several hours, nobody on board would ever see him again. So at 7:40 p.m. the day before Thanksgiving, Northwest Orient Flight 305 left Seattle. The passengers were gone, the ransom money was on board, the parachutes were on board, and Dan Cooper was sitting somewhere in the back of this Boeing 727. There are now just 5 people on this airplane, the 3 people in the flight deck, the flight attendant Tina McCullough, and Dan Cooper. That's it. A Boeing 727 flying south through the night with a hijacker in the back, and 4 people whose job it was to somehow get the airplane safely to Reno. Of course, now that we know the full passenger load, kind of was a ghost flight even beforehand. Before departure, Cooper had given specific instructions as we spoke about. Cabin lights were to be turned off. The crew was to stay forward. He wanted the rear of the airplane to himself. The flight attendant remained with him for a time. Then, at Cooper's instruction, she went forward towards the cockpit. She would become the last person known to have seen Dan Cooper alive. Think about that. She walks away from the man sitting in the back of the airplane. The lights are out. The Boeing 727 continues south. And from that moment on, nobody knows exactly what happened back there. With the flight heading south, and with the characteristics of how this aircraft was being operated, low and slow, and at or below 10,000 feet with the landing gear down and 15 degrees of flaps. This was not the normal way a 727 would be operated on a routine trip to Nevada. The airplane was being flown this way because the man in the back had a very specific plan for what he wanted to do next. And here's something I want to make clear about this section. The crew wasn't flying blind to what Cooper was doing. They knew his intended use was the rear air stairs. They knew why the airplane was being flown low and slow, but they didn't know exactly when he was going to leave, and that's the very important distinction here. At some point during the flight, the crew received an indication associated with the rear stairs. After takeoff and the crew squarely in front of the aircraft, an alarm was sounded in the flight deck. The alarm indicated it was associated with the rear stairs, and then at approximately 8:13 p.m., the airplane experienced what the crew described as a sudden upward movement. That moment would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. Now let's be precise. Nobody on the flight deck saw Dan Cooper jump. There was no camera recording him. There was no flight attendant standing at the back watching. What we have is the aircraft's behavior, a sudden change, and the fact that Cooper was gone when the airplane eventually landed. So when you hear the exact statement that D.B. Cooper jumped out at 8:13, it's kind of shorthand. A more accurate way to say it is investigators believe Cooper likely left the aircraft around that time. And that's an important distinction. We haven't talked much about the weather that was happening, but as good aviators, right, we should talk about the weather. And the moment that he left. Imagine what happened next. It's nighttime, it's November, Northern Oregon, not as cold as Illinois, but still not warm as Mexico City. So imagine what happened next. He's standing at the back of a 727. It's nighttime, like we said, Pacific Northwest in November. And he has $200,000 and mostly $20 bills with him. I think they weren't able to get him exactly all 20s. So he disappears into the darkness. No goodbye, no final message, nothing. Because we don't know the exact point of where Cooper exited. Rain was in the forecast, also covers up any potential trace of maybe what happened. But this is a fascinating part about it. The crew didn't immediately know for certain that Cooper was gone. They continued flying, and at one point they communicated with him with no response. Eventually it became clear. The man who had hijacked their airplane wasn't on it anymore. And now and always in our story, the 727 is still flying. Think about it. Cooper's gone, the crew's up front. They still have the airplane with its landing gear down and flaps extended. They still have to manage the fuel, they have to navigate. This is before ForeFlight, right? And they still have to get this airplane safely in the ground. The hijacking may have been over, but the flight wasn't. And when Flight 305 eventually landed in Reno, the authorities surrounded the plane. When they searched it, Dan Cooper was gone. The ransom money was gone, and one of the greatest manhunts in American history was about to begin. Somewhere between Seattle and Reno, a man had vanished. Maybe he landed safely, maybe he didn't. Maybe he walked away with $200,000, maybe he survived the jump. And for more than 50 years, nobody has been able to prove which one happened. Because there's only one person who knows exactly what happened after those air stairs were open, and that was Dan Cooper, or DB, if you so choose. The airplane was on the ground, the hijacking was over, but the mystery had just started. Somewhere between Seattle and Reno, Dan Cooper had left the airplane. At least that's what investigators believed. And now they had a problem. Where was Dan? The crew knew approximately when the airplane experienced a sudden upward movement. That gave investigators an important clue, but it didn't give them an exact spot on the ground. Because this wasn't a car stopping on the side of the road. It was a 727 moving through the air at night with wind over a huge area of the Pacific Northwest. And keep in mind, too, before our friends with FlightAware or any other tracking service, ADSB, were readily available. So somewhere between the airplane and the ground, there's a whole lot of uncertainty. If you're trying to reconstruct this as an aviation event, there are several questions. Exactly where was the airplane? What was its actual ground track? What were the winds at different altitudes? How long was Cooper in free fall? When did the parachute open? And how far did he drift? And then you have one enormous problem. We don't actually know exactly what Cooper did after leaving the airplane. Did he immediately deploy the chute? Did he free fall first? Did he have control of the parachute? We don't know. So even if you know approximately where the airplane was, it doesn't automatically tell you where the man landed. Investigators began focusing their search on an enormous area of the Pacific Northwest. The early search effort concentrated heavily on southwestern Washington, and authorities searched by air and by ground. Think about the terrain, the forests, the rivers, the mountains, remote areas, and it was 1971. Let's not forget about that. I also heard too about a lot of pot farmers out there, and that maybe he was a part of that because a lot of people were growing weed up in the Pacific Northwest then, probably still are. Just so many cool things. You should go look into that side to it. I don't know how far we're going to get into it, but D.B. Cooper being this pot farmer and being with all kind of the hippies and the pot farms up there, kind of interesting. No GPS in his pocket, no cell phone suddenly pinging from the middle of the woods, no social media posting saying, I made it, 2 thumbs up, give me a big smash if you like this story. None of that. None of that glory. If Cooper was out there, he could be incredibly difficult to find. Now, the investigators weren't starting from nothing. They had witnesses, they had a description, they had evidence left on the airplane, and one of the most famous pieces of evidence was this tie. Cooper left behind the black tie, the one that's on the back of the Mini Cooper today. And that tie would eventually become one of the most important physical pieces of evidence in the entire case. At the time, it was evidence. That's all it was. Decades later, advances in technology would allow investigators and researchers to look at evidence in completely different ways. We've seen all that. We've seen all the crime podcasts. Not a crime podcast. You all know that story there. So we'll get back to that. But because the tie has generated some fascinating and sometimes highly debated theories about who Cooper may have been, it's important to highlight at least right now. The money. They also had another potential way to find Cooper. The money. $200,000, $10,000 $20 bills. Again, I think there was a little bit off on how much of he had got 20s. Investigators have recorded the serial numbers. Now, from what I can find, I don't think they were able to get all the serial numbers, but a good portion of them. That meant if Cooper started spending the money, somebody somewhere would notice, right? The way it works is maybe nobody's looking at the serial number when you go in and buy. I mean, people don't buy with cash anymore, really. I kind of do here and there, but okay, you go in and you spend a 20. It's not like someone at the convenience store is handing that over for a serial search, but eventually all that money gets back to the bank, right? I mean, if you look at Like all the money back then, I have an old 20 in my wallet from 1985. Somebody in my life, frequently every time I open my wallet, says, "Is that money, Grandpa?" Kind of is. But if you think about it, right, new money, new circulation, eventually it all makes its way back to the bank. So that's a way for them to find them. So, but it's a waiting game, right? That's not immediate. If you start spending money, you'll find it when it gets back to a bank somewhere and start to put pieces together. Maybe somebody somewhere will notice over time. He also left with $200,000, which is nothing to sneeze at. So, I mean, if we've all seen Breaking Bad, you need to buy a car wash, you need to wash that money, you gotta figure something to do with it, right? You can't just walk in and say, "I have $200,000 I found in my mattress, and I would like to deposit that right now, please." And just so you all don't have to do your own sort of configuration, I went and looked, and in 1971 to today dollars, $200,000 would be roughly $1.65 million. So it's a good chunk of change for back in the day. Good chunk of change, for sure. As the FBI does, or did, they gave the investigation a nickname, and I had not heard this nickname through any of my stuff in the past that I've watched. Only through my own research was NORJAC, or the Northwest Hijacking. I don't think that really caught on. People just like to say DB Cooper. Of course, nobody says that anymore from what I understand either. This case would grow into one of the most extensive investigations in FBI history. Hey, Trump's been releasing a lot of stuff lately. Maybe this is on the release. I don't know. Maybe they've already released all of it. I'm not sure. Investigators had the people who had spent hours with him, the flight attendants, the crew, and eventually investigators developed a familiar composite image. A middle-aged man, dark hair, business suit, and dark tie. A face that, depending on which sketch you look at, seems almost deliberately ordinary. And that's part of what makes this image so haunting. He didn't look like a movie villain. He didn't look like someone trying to be famous. He looked like a guy you might pass in an airport and never remember. That's probably me for most people. I went into my dental hygienist today, and I've seen her 3 times, and she's like, "I've never seen you before in my life." So I'm memorable. That's what I'm getting at. Investigators had a description, they had a witness, they had a tie, they had a serial number for $200,000, and they had an approximate time when Cooper left the airplane. And they had absolutely no idea where he was. And the search was about to get even stranger. Because 9 years later, somebody would find something. Not Cooper, not the parachute, and not the briefcase, but money. Money from the ransom. Buried along the Colombian River. And instead of solving the mystery, it made it even more confusing. It's 9 years later, and they found nothing up to that point. No confirmed sighting of Dan Cooper, no parachute, no body, and not a single ransom bill had surfaced. Then, in February of 1980, that changed. It came from an 8-year-old boy. His name was Brian Ingram. He was 8 years old, and he was with his family along the Colombian River at a place called Tina Bar. Tina Bar is on the Washington side of the Colombian River. Brian was digging in the sand, and then he found something, old $20 bills. At first, it probably looked like somebody had lost some money, but this wasn't just money. The bills were badly deteriorated, and when investigators checked the serial numbers, they matched the D.B. Cooper ransom. In total, Brian found $5,800. That would be 290 $20 bills. Less than 3% of the original $200,000. But suddenly, after 9 years, investigators had physical evidence connected directly to the ransom. This was a massive discovery, because until then, there had been no confirmed recovery of any ransom money. And remember, the FBI had recorded the serial numbers. So there was no question of where this money came from. This wasn't somebody saying, "Hey, look at these old $20 bills, they may be connected to Cooper." Investigators could actually match the numbers. The money created a brand new mystery. How did it get there? And I want to be careful here. Finding the money at Tina Bar doesn't automatically mean Cooper landed at Tina Bar. In fact, that's one of the biggest misconceptions about the discovery. The location where the money was found is not necessarily the location where Cooper landed. There are several possibilities about the money. Maybe Cooper survived and somehow lost the money. Maybe some of the money entered the river and was carried downstream. You can find whole long videos about how sentiment would have buried it, or the opposite, how it wouldn't. You can find either way. And maybe the money was deliberately buried. And the last one is where things start to get really strange, because investigators and researchers had spent decades trying to figure out how those bills ended up where they did. And there is no universally accepted answer. I know, frustrating, right? And just think, before I came out with this podcast, you didn't even know how frustrated you were with this story. The money wasn't just scattered randomly across the beach. It was found in 3 bundles. The bundles were still held together by their deteriorated rubber bands. And that detail would become extremely important, because that raises another question. If the money had simply fallen from the sky during the jump, how did it end up in bundles? How did it... For a second, I sounded like that guy. Liberty, bibbity, bibbity, bibbity. How did it get in bundles? I'm sorry. One of the stupidest commercials around. I mean, what? They just guys like, bibbity, liberty. Sorry, I'll get back on this. How did it get into this particular place, and how did it stay there? Again, nobody has been able to prove the answer. So this is... personally, probably one of the parts of the DP Cooper story. Listen, I'm starting to get tired here, folks, of the DP Cooper story that I personally find most fascinating, because I can come up with theories about who Cooper was. I can look at the airplane, I can look at the parachute, I can look at the jump. But this physical evidence, 290 bills, $5,800, and somebody can actually go to the place where they found it. How the hell did it get there? Now, you might be thinking, okay, they found some of the money, great, follow the rest of the money. Well, that didn't happen. The remaining ransom money was never recovered. And as far as publicly known, it was never conclusively traced to Cooper. The discovery also creates another bizarre chapter. Brian Ingram had found the money. The federal government took custody of it as evidence, and years later, much of the recovered money was ultimately returned to Brian. I hope that he saved that money and didn't spend it, because you know how much people would pay for one of DB Cooper's 20s? Now, keep in mind, too, this was Northwest money, so I don't know exactly how that works. Let's see. 80... Northwest would have still been around. I don't know. Our friend Derek Martin, who's on the podcast, we could always ask him. It might affect his pension. He worked for Northwest. Maybe he was DB Cooper. So imagine being 8 years old. You're digging around on the riverbank. You find some old money. It turns out to be part of a famous unsolved hijack in American history. Or, as other people would put it, a Norjack. I don't think anybody ever used Norjack to describe this incident, but maybe they did. I'm going to start telling people I know about a Norjack. We'll see what they say. See what comes to mind. Maybe, of course, if you're not getting DB Cooper, nobody's getting Norjack. They could probably reuse that around now. I don't know. We got enough stuff going on, right? We can name something Norjack, I'm sure. So our friend here, Mr. Ingram, he gets to keep $5,800. It's a pretty good day at the beach. The discovery at Tina Bar should have been a breakthrough. Instead, it became another question. Where did Cooper jump? Where did he land? Did he survive? And part of this is, how did the ransom end up getting buried along the Columbian River? 9 years after Dan Cooper disappeared, the real piece of him had finally been found. But it wasn't enough to find him. And if you thought finding some of the ransom money would narrow down the suspects, think again. Over the several decades, the FBI would investigate hundreds and eventually thousands of possible suspects. Military veterans, pilots, parachutists, criminals, ordinary men with extraordinary stories, and every once in a while somebody would come along and say, I know who D.B. Cooper was. The problem was nobody could prove it. So I'm going to save you some time right now before you get on the rabbit holes of all these other ones. They're interesting, they're fascinating. But at the end of the day, they're theories. So you can take which theory you want and go with it. But we still don't know who Dan Cooper was. And that, honestly, is probably what makes part of this story so interesting to people. Because you kind of can see this Robin Hood scenario, except for Robin Hood stole from the rich and gave to the poor. But in this case, I think the way he's revered is he didn't hurt anybody. He got them to their destination, and then he left. And he left with the company's money, right? And quite honestly, I think all of us can admit when you're talking about a company's money versus an individual, you probably start to say, "Hey, I've been a little less sympathetic about that Northwest." But I just, of course, at the end of the day, there is this component to it where he was a criminal, but a criminal who didn't hurt anybody. So you begin this kind of folklore of, oh, look, he's this guy in aviation that took from the man and wanted to get back, especially if he was a pot farmer up in the Pacific Northwest. All of the people that it possibly could be. We should probably talk about Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. And I want to be extremely clear about this. Richard McCoy was not identified by the FBI as D.B. Cooper, but his name became part of a conversation for various obvious reasons. Just months after the Cooper hijacking, McCoy carried out a remarkably similar crime. He hijacked a Boeing 727, demanded money, and parachuted from the rear of the aircraft. That is not speculation, that actually happened. So naturally people started asking, what's this guy? Isn't it the same guy that did this other one? The problem was, investigators did not establish that McCoy was Cooper. Richard Floyd McCoy hijacked United Airlines Flight 855 in April 1972 and demanded ransom and escaped by parachute from a Boeing 727. And you can admit, after all that, from an aviation standpoint, that is one hell of a coincidence. A guy hijacking a 727, you have another guy that's hijacked a 727, both involve ransom and parachutes and getting out of the back, but coincidence isn't proof. Then we have Kenneth Christensen, another name that has received a lot of attention. Kenneth worked for Northwest Airlines, and that alone gets people's attention. Because if Cooper had inside knowledge about the airline, the airplane, or aviation operations, this obviously would make a lot of sense, right? Well, an airline employee sounds like an interesting place to start. But again, interesting isn't the same as proven. Christensen was investigated and became a popular suspect in books and documentaries, but the FBI never publicly confirmed that he was D.B. Cooper. Then there's Robert Rackstraw. Robert Rackstraw, another man in the background that made people wonder. He's an Army veteran, he had aviation experience, and he became the subject of extensive public speculation. But again, there was no definitive identification. And this is where the Cooper case gets dangerous if you're trying to tell it accurately. You can take one interesting coincidence and stack it upon another interesting coincidence, and by the time you've watched a 3-hour documentary, you've convinced that you've solved the case and you're going to call the FBI up. Cash Patel, I know what happened. That's your next call, right? And almost every Cooper suspect has the same problem. Something fits and something doesn't. Maybe the guy knew airplanes, but he didn't match the description. Maybe he looked like the sketch, but he had no parachuting experience. Maybe he had the right military background, but couldn't be placed in the Pacific Northwest at the time that the incident happened. Or maybe his family finds an old story after he dies. He once told us he did something big. Okay, that could mean anything. I mean, I had an uncle tell me once he did something big, and that was ripping off Kmart and taking all their ice cube trays and their fake Christmas tree, and they busted him, and he had to go back. But that's not as big as this. So, it's kind of the same with any question in life, right? We want to solve everything. We want to solve the mysteries of life. And we all want the answers so badly. The moment that you start to give into that, the suspect makes sense, and we want all the rest of the pieces to fit. We look at the evidence and say, okay, this guy knew how to jump. This guy worked around airplanes. This guy kind of looked like the sketch. This guy disappeared for a few days, and suddenly it's solved. But except we haven't, because the FBI investigated more than 1,000 serious suspects, and none of them were proven to be Dan Cooper. And then there are the confessions. This case has attracted them too. People claiming to know something, family members claiming someone confessed, researchers claiming they've cracked the case. And some of those stories are fascinating, but without physical evidence tying a person to the airplane, the ransom, or the crime, a story is just a story. In 2016, the FBI announced that it was redirecting resources away from the active D.B. Cooper investigation. I mean, come on, what were they doing in 2016? Was there a guy at a Caprice Classic eating an egg salad sandwich waiting on someone's house? I doubt it. So I don't really know what that means. Maybe that means you took it off your Outlook calendar, D.B. Cooper case. I don't know. I shouldn't just. Maybe they had other stuff they were doing, but I doubt it that far into the future. Case wasn't solved. They didn't solve it. Simply said, after 45 years, it was time to focus investigative resources elsewhere. But they also made something very clear. If new physical evidence emerges, they'll take a look at it. So more than after 1,000 suspects, decades of theories, after books, documentaries, investigations, people claiming they finally knew the truth, people still don't know this story. Oh, sorry. We're still left with the same problem. Who was Dan Cooper? And maybe even the bigger question, did he actually survive? Because before we can figure out who he was, we have to figure out whether he ever made it to the ground alive. We spent the following hour following a man who hijacked a Boeing 727, demanded $200,000, got 4 parachutes, and then jumped out of the back of an airplane somewhere between Seattle and Reno. And now we get to the question that nobody's been able to answer. Did he survive? Let's start with the obvious. The jump was dangerous, really dangerous, according to experts. The FBI itself said there are some pretty compelling reasons to believe Cooper may have not survived. First, the parachute. Cooper jumped with 2 parachutes. One was his primary, the other was a reserve. But here's the kicker. One of the parachutes he took was actually a training parachute. It had been sewn shut. So Cooper had 4 parachutes available to him. And he apparently chose to jump with one that couldn't actually be deployed. Now, this sounds pretty significant mistake, but there's an important detail. He apparently didn't know that the parachute had been disabled. So if you're trying to argue that Cooper was some highly experienced professional skydiver, that piece of evidence exactly doesn't help the case. Then there's the ground. Cooper wasn't jumping onto an airport. He wasn't jumping over an open field. He was jumping into the Pacific Northwest at night into a heavily wooded terrain. And there's a big difference between landing a parachute on a nice open field and landing one in a forest. Trees, branches, uneven ground, water, power lines. God knows what else is underneath them. And then you add the weather. The November in the Pacific Northwest was dark. The conditions weren't exactly what you would order if someone told you, hey, you want to go skydiving tonight? But here's where I want to be careful. You're going to hear some very dramatic descriptions of the weather in the Cooper case. Some old reports describe extremely severe conditions, but the exact conditions at the exact point where Cooper exited the airplane are not something we can establish with absolute certainty. And then there's what he was wearing, a business suit and dress shoes. It's not exactly ideal parachuting equipment. Imagine trying to land in a forest at night. This wasn't a guy standing on the edge of a perfectly prepared skydiving platform. He was jumping into the unknown. Here's the problem with the saying, well, obviously he died. We don't have a body. We don't have his parachute. We don't have the rest of the money. We don't have a confirmed crash site. Nothing. And that's why the survival theory refuses to die, no pun intended. Or maybe completely pun intended. Because if Cooper survived, he had a huge advantage. Nobody knew who he was. Nobody knew exactly where he landed, and nobody knew what he did after that. He could have changed his appearance, he could have changed his name, he could have gotten rid of the money. He could have simply disappeared into normal life, and if he did, he was very good at keeping his mouth shut. Which we know a lot of people are not good at doing that, especially yours truly. Better never jump out of the back of the plane. 10,000 $20 bills, the serial numbers were recorded, and almost none of that money ever surfaced, except for the $5,800, the money found at Tina's bar. If Cooper survived, where did the other $94,200 go? $194,000. Let's not cut Mr. Cooper short. $194,000 go. That's a lot of money to disappear, especially when every bill has a serial number. So you're probably going to say, Jeff, what's your opinion? I don't really know, honestly. I don't know where I land on this. Pun again intended, completely intended. Not necessarily that Cooper died, and not necessarily that he lived. I think the thing about a conspiracy theory, right, is a good conspiracy theory just takes on another conspiracy theory. I mean, even if tomorrow somebody walked forward and said it's me, somebody would say that's not him. And I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting thought. I would lean towards he died because I just can't imagine somebody would keep their mouth shut that whole time. But the money always confused me, and the way that the money ended up on the riverbank with bands on it. So, did Mr. Cooper get out and then decide that he didn't want the smoke that was coming along with what he did, and so he just bet back into a mediocre life? I don't know. I think the most interesting thing about the case is that both possibilities have problems. If he died, why did they never find him? And if he lived, why did they never find him? And that is the Cooper mystery, basically in one sentence. And there's one more thing that keeps the mystery alive: evidence. Not theories, not somebody's uncle claiming he was Cooper, actual evidence. The tie, the parachute, the money, and eventually DNA. And that's where things get really interesting. The moment that you're the FBI. You're in there thinking you're getting fired because your computer's not working right. You have an unsolved hijacking or a norjacking. you don't even you don't even know the man's real name. You don't even know exactly where he landed. You don't even know for certain whether he survived, but you know one thing, and that's evidence. When Cooper boarded the Northwest Orient Flight 305, he was dressed like a businessman. White shirt, black tie, dark suit, and eventually, he left that tie behind. A black clip-on tie. Yeah, not much of a tire, this guy. I'm sure he did that so he didn't get it wrapped up in a parachute. I don't know. He did take the thing off, though, so okay. Now, in 1971, nobody knew how important that little piece of clothing might eventually become, like everything that has been left behind in crimes. But investigators kept it, and decades later, technology changed. In the early 2000s, investigators were able to recover DNA from the tie. That sounds like the kind of thing that should solve this case. And this is where we have to be really careful, because people sometimes say they got Cooper's DNA. That's not quite the same thing as saying they got a complete DNA profile that proves who Cooper was. The FBI had a DNA sample, but it wasn't enough to definitively identify Cooper. And then there was another interesting discovery. Researchers examining the tie found particles and traces that some people interpreted as potentially significant. Elements associated with industrial or aerospace environments have been discussed. And that's where I'm going to hit the brakes just a little bit. Because finding a particle on a tie automatically doesn't tell you where a person worked. It doesn't tell you what airplane they worked on, and it certainly doesn't give you a name. It's a clue, not a confession. There's also the tie clip, a small detail, but in a mystery like this, small details become big details. Because investigators could examine what Cooper was wearing, what he carried, and how he behaved, and what he left behind. All of those pieces create a picture, but still not a person. And it gets a little frustrating, right? Think about what Cooper actually left behind. A tie, a parachute equipment, or the airplane itself, witness descriptions, the ransom, the serial numbers, and eventually $5,800 on a riverbank down by Tina's where he got himself a Mai Tai. That's not nothing. That's pretty good evidence locker, right? If this was CSI, you think Grissom would have it squared away. Again, if you don't even know this story, you're not going to know who Grissom is in CSI, so let's just keep on moving. And yet, we're still thinking here, more than 50 years later, asking who he was. And there's another thing people sometimes assume. Did they get his fingerprints? Well, investigators did recover fingerprints and other physical evidence from the aircraft, but again, none that produced a confirmed identity. And this is an important lesson in forensic investigation. Evidence doesn't always equal identification. Sometimes evidence simply narrows the possibilities, sometimes it creates more questions, and sometimes it sits in an evidence room for 50 years. And that's what makes the Cooper case so fascinating. Because the crime happened in 1971, but we're still trying to solve it in the 21st century using 21st century technologies. DNA, digital databases, advanced forensic analysis, modern aviation reconstruction. We can do things today the investigators in 1971 could only dream about. But none of that changes the fundamental problem. We still don't have that one piece of evidence that would end the argument, a definitive identification. It's interesting even today with, if you think about the gap that Cooper exploited in 1971, we've gotten incredibly good at reconstructing what an airplane did. We can track an aircraft down to incredibly precise locations. We can model flight paths. We can analyze parachute performance. All of that not available in 1971. And all of those fact-finding people today trying to piece together what happened in 1971, still there is this misunderstanding of what exactly happened to Cooper. And maybe that's why the case has survived for more than half a century. Because every time we think we found an answer, there's another question. The money tells us something, the tie tells us something, the airplane tells us something, the witnesses tell us something, but none of them tell us everything. And eventually the FBI stopped actively pursuing the case. But the public never really stopped, because somewhere out there may still be an answer. And there may still be some people out there who think they know exactly what that answer is, and maybe they do. So, after everything we've talked about tonight, what do we actually know? We know a man calling himself Dan Cooper boarded Northwest Orient Flight 305. We know he was carrying a bomb, or at least convinced the crew that he was. We know he demanded $200,000. We know he wanted parachutes. We know he understood enough about the Boeing 727 to make every very specific demands about how the airplane was flown. And we know somewhere between Seattle and Reno, he opened the rear air stairs and disappeared. We don't know exactly where he landed. We don't know whether he survived. We don't know his real name. We don't know where he came from, and we don't know where he went. But we do know something else. He left behind just enough evidence to make sure we never stop looking. The tie, the parachutes, the money, the fingerprints, the DNA, the witness descriptions, all of those things give pieces of Dan Cooper, but none of them give us the whole man. And if you're on this channel, then we're all somewhat aviation enthusiasts, connoisseurs, whatever you want to throw at it. And so there is some fascination here, right? And that's probably what fascinates me the most, is just, this wasn't a robbery. It wasn't just a ransom. The airplane wasn't just a part of the plan. It was the plan. The Boeing 727 had the rear air stairs, that unusual configuration that gave Cooper the opportunity that most airliners simply didn't. He knew it, he used it. And then the airplane landed in Reno without him. I was at the Reno once, then Chuckle Bucket. It was a lovely time. I don't know why Dan parachuted out. Think about how incredible that actually is. A commercial airliner, a hijacking, or norjacking, as other people in the FBI say, a parachute, $200,000, and a man who simply vanished. What do you guys think? It's an interesting thought on what exactly happened. Did Dan Cooper survive? I don't know. Does anybody know? Honestly? That's kind of the question, right? I'm not sure if I want to know either. Because if somebody actually finds a body or somebody produces a piece of evidence that definitively identifies him, the mystery is over. And that's what makes this case so different. It's November 24th, 1971, and a Boeing 727 is flying through darkness. There's a man in the back, he has a bag of money, he has a parachute, and nobody in the airplane knows what happened to him. The rear air stairs come down, and somewhere below, there's darkness, then nothing. For 45 years, we've been trying to figure out what happened to D.B. Cooper, and maybe someday we'll find out. But until then, he's out there. Maybe. He's pretty old at this point. If you go by the descriptions, he's probably passed on. But somebody might know who he is. Hey, look at that. We made it through the story and only within 1 hour and 24 minutes. If you guys are on a plane listening to this, thanks for coming along on that journey. I enjoyed it. I like this story. I just personally feel like it's been done and overdone and documentaries, and what kind of fool am I to think that I could add anything to this story? But I'll say this channel has grown enough where people ask me about the stories that are on it, and I constantly heard about the car. Oh, DB Cooper, oh, he has a podcast on that. And I would be like, I don't, because I feel like everybody knows the story 8 million ways to Sunday. Like, I've heard it many times over my life, but I guess it's just a sign at how old I'm getting that nobody remembers anymore, or perhaps that I'm dorky enough to know it. But for those of you that did know the story, I have a quick, let's say, 10-minute story for you. Because I told you I would give this to you at the beginning. A little Easter egg nugget that my brother actually recently told me about, and I didn't believe it until I went and looked it up. And that is the Cessna that wouldn't land. There is a Cessna 172 out there that just wouldn't come down. It spent 64 days, 22 hours, 19 minutes, and 5 seconds in the air to create a new world record. Okay, we've spent the last hour talking about hijackings, parachutes, ransom money, and a guy who jumped out of the back of a 727 and disappeared. So I figured we should end this episode on something that maybe people don't know as much about. And I want to tell you about two guys who apparently looked at a Cessna 172 and thought, you know what this airplane needs? About 2 months without landing. And I'm not kidding. In 1958, two pilots took off in a Cessna 172 into the sky, and they didn't land for 64 days, 22 hours, 19 minutes, and 5 seconds. That's almost 65 days in a Cessna 172. I've had about enough in that time, about 3 hours, and I want to get out, at least for a minute or two. Two guys, one little airplane, and absolutely no interest in touching the ground. The flight began on December 4th, 1958, and ended February 7th, 1959. The guy behind this insanity was Robert Tim. Robert was a slot machine mechanic at the Hacienda Hotel in Las Vegas. That's pretty cool. He was also a pilot, and apparently had a pretty good relationship with the idea of doing things that most normal people would consider completely unnecessary. Robert came up with the idea of setting an endurance record in a small airplane, and the Hacienda Hotel sponsored it. Good for them. I don't know if that would have happened this day. Now, AOP, I should say, does say that Robert, on top of being a slot machine mechanic, was a World War II bomber pilot, and the person who proposed the Endurance Flight project to Hacienda owner Doc Bailey. Now, you might be asking yourself, why? I don't know, it seems like a pretty good idea so far. Why would anybody want to spend 2 months flying around in a Cessna? And the answer is publicity. The Hacienda wanted attention, and apparently they decided that having a little Cessna 172 flying around Nevada for 2 months was a pretty good way to get it. The flight was designed as a publicity effort for the Hacienda Hotel, with Robert's project receiving financial backing from said hotel. But you can't just take your average 172, fill it with gas, put 2 guys in it, and say, see you in April. They had to seriously modify the airplane. They installed a 95-gallon belly tank. The modified fuel system, it would allow transfer between the wing tanks. The modified airplane engine oil and oil filters could be serviced without shutting down the engine. They even removed the co-pilot seat because apparently when you're going to live in a Cessna for 65 days, legroom becomes a secondary concern. Now let's talk about something important. Bathroom. It was the first thing. When my brother told me the story, I was like, get the hell out of here. Where did they go to the bathroom? Obviously there wasn't one. So these couple of guys must have gotten pretty close with each other. They did have a little stainless steel tank in the back. They could wash up, shave, brush their teeth. Basically, the world's smallest RV. Now, I'm assuming that the modified stainless steel sink for washing and shaving was separate from the modified tank for using the bathroom. Robert originally had another co pilot, but after several attempts and some mechanical problems, that relationship wasn't working out. Entered John Wayne Cook. John was an aircraft mechanic and pilot, and he agreed to go up with Robert, which in retrospect was probably the most consequential, sure, I'll try, in aviation history. John, an aircraft mechanic and pilot who had flown professionally, joined Roberts for the successful record attempt after early attempts had failed. On December 4th, 1958, Robert and John took off from McCarran Field in Las Vegas. Harry Reid never will be called that. Oh, yeah, it was. And this wasn't just some guy secretly flying around hoping nobody noticed. There were plenty of people watching, and there were cameras, and there was publicity. And there was even a car driving around the runway to make sure the airplane didn't cheat. The successful flight departed McCarran Field at about almost 4 p.m. local time on December 4th, 1958. Officials used a car and marked the aircraft's tires to verify they had not secretly landed. Interesting. Now, here's the story it gets completely ridiculous. How do you refuel a Cessna that's already flying? You don't land. You bring the gas station to the airplane. A specifically equipped truck would drive along a straight stretch of road. I'm not kidding here. The Cessna would fly above it. The crew would lower a hook. The ground crew would connect a fuel hose, and they would pump fuel into the airplane while it was flying. Again, this is a Cessna 172, not an Air Force tanker, what we've seen in the movies. It's a Cessna. The ground-to-air refueling operation involved a specifically equipped truck and a hose pass to the aircraft when it flew low and slow overhead. This was repeated 128 times during the duration of that flight. Think about that. That's 128 separate fueling operations. Every single one meant getting a little airplane lined up with a moving truck while you're already in the air. Lucky thing they were in Nevada, because that's probably where you're only going to find that straight stretch of road, or that southwest region. They also needed oil. It wasn't just fuel. They had to keep the engine alive, so oil, maintenance, supplies, food, water, everything they needed had to somehow get from the ground into the airplane, and it wasn't allowed to land. Now let's address the obvious. How do two grown men live in a Cessna 172 for 65 days? The answer is not particularly comfortable. They did take out that seat, remember. They got the leg room. They took turns flying. They ate meals that were chopped up and put into thermos containers so they could be passed into the airplane. They exercised, they read, they played games, and they slept. Or at least they tried to. And this is where the story stops being funny, because flying an airplane for 65 days obviously has problems. One of them is sleep, and one night, Robert fell asleep. He woke up. The airplane was flying itself. The autopilot was still working, but the airplane had traveled away from where Robert expected it to be. He eventually got his bearings and got things under control, and that's one of those moments when you realize maybe this wasn't such a great idea after all. He fell asleep reportedly on the 36th day afloat and woke, as we said, to find the aircraft basically flying on its own. The airplane started getting tired too. The generator failed, the autopilot eventually failed, other equipment stopped working, the cabin heater failed, lights failed, the fuel system developed problems, and the engine was accumulating carbon. They had been flying for weeks. The airplane was basically saying, guys, seriously? On January 23rd, they broke the existing endurance record. But Robert and John apparently looked at each other and said, let's keep going, where a normal person might have said, we broke it, let's stop. And also, too, that's a pretty good stretch the first person went as well. January 23rd, I mean, if you think about it, that's a couple months in the air, probably the same thing going on. Who knew all these people were doing all these crazy things before Red Bull? Apparently, breaking the record wasn't enough. The pair broke the existing record on January 23rd, 1959, but continued flying another 15 days. Finally, on February 7th, 1959, after 64 days, 22 hours, 19 minutes, and 5 seconds, they landed. One takeoff, one landing, almost 65 days in between. They had covered roughly 150,000 miles. That's roughly equivalent to going around the Earth 6 times. And here's my favorite part. After all of that, John Cook reportedly summed it up by saying, "There sure seemed to be a lot of fuss over a flight with one takeoff and one landing." And that's the story of the longest continuous flight of an aircraft made. Two guys, a Cessna 172, a fuel truck, a whole lot of thermos containers, and 65 days of looking at the same desert. And you know what? After spending an hour talking about D.B. Cooper, I think it's a perfect way to end. Because Cooper got out of the airplane and disappeared. Both with Robert and John spent nearly 65 days trying their absolute hardest to make sure the airplane didn't disappear. And somehow both stories became aviation legends. So, my friends, this has been quite the episode. I know I have stuff to catch up with all of you on. I'll try to follow up in the email on that. We got some other interviews coming up here soon. Things are going well on the podcast. If you want to get on the website and purchase one of our podcast stickers or our challenge coins, please do so. Going to be bouncing around a little bit. Waco plans are working. Just got to get my own headspace squared away with plans and the chicken before the egg thing. My intention, hopefully, at some point here over the winter. But like I've always said, I'm not going to rush it. I'm going to find the right thing that works for me, the same as I would suggest to any of you. But until next time, my friends, I'll see you down the runway.